Great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me here. Can you hear me well and see my screen? All right, okay. So yeah, thanks so much for inviting me to kind of reflect on Taco and Adil's excellent presentations and some solutions presented here. I'm coming to you from the Community Energy Association. We support local governments and Indigenous communities across BC and increasingly elsewhere in Canada on all things climate and energy, from research and planning stage up to project implementation. We're based all over the province, but I'm coming to you here from Vancouver on the unceded ancestral homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. I'm really grateful to be in a role right now thinking about just a better future for all of us, including Indigenous communities and vulnerable populations across the province. I get the sense that maybe I should take a little shorter amount of time than maybe planned. So I think I'll just skip through some of these slides on CEA. I do welcome you to get in touch though if you're curious about what we do. I'd like to frame this moment in time, which I think Adil and Taco did beautifully, really around the massive sense of loss that I think we feel, the loss of life, of course, as well as the loss of, all this momentum, leading up to climate emergency declarations across BC, and, municipalities having to cut their climate budgets in order to respond to this crisis and take care of their community members. So there was that loss. And we also saw our community leaders really, feel responsible for taking action. And we saw, I think, massive movement across the world where, lives were prioritized over economy, which I think was really inspiring to see kind of what the decisions were made in order to minimize as much as possible the loss of life. But of course, that led to this economic shutdown that we're in and massive repercussions for people across all sectors. And now we're in this moment of opportunity. And I'll talk a little bit about that decision point. And I think there's, at all levels, decision makers have the power to use some of these solutions presented by folks like Taco and Adil and really put that to work at a local level and help move towards multiple benefits that we'd like to see in our communities. I have some slides here that really kind of frame up the job loss, but I think I will skip that. I will send out a link though. CEA, we have an infographic that kind of captures all of this in some graphs, but I think the main takeaway here is that really the types of job losses this time around have been very different from other recessions. It's quite different folks who have lost jobs than in sort of recessions in our memory. And we need to respond differently. We can't just invest in the similar kinds of industries in order to get out of the shutdown. So it's mostly women, young people, lower wage workers, folks who are racialized that have been that have suffered the most. So yeah, I'll skip through some of these here. And as we've heard from the other speakers, like we really are in another crisis of climate change, and I really love those parallels that we saw between the pandemic and the climate crisis, and the fact that the climate crisis is also, a planetary health emergency of its own right. So when we speak with local governments a lot, and many local governments are kind of on this page already of understanding the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report about limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. What does that mean? It really means cutting our emissions down to nothing, net zero emissions by 2050. And we have to balance all of these other goals that Taco and Adil both eloquently stated around building up justice and equity. We won't respond properly to the climate crisis if all people aren't brought along as part of the solution. And then, of course, we need to have some kind of economy. I think, obviously, we can't just completely shut down the economy to respond to climate change. So how do we transition that economy in a just way that is also responding itself to the climate crisis? And respond to health goals, not just some of the immediate health needs that we see right now, but how do we ensure that long-term people aren't suffering as much as predicted there that we saw in that slide from climate change. And then we also have to build resiliency and adapt to what we already know are the locked-in climate impacts that we're going to be seeing in our communities. And when I talk about resiliency, it's also the social resiliency. It's not just withstanding a flood, but how do we make sure that our communities themselves are resilient to all sorts of hardships. So I want to share with you all like this framework that we've put together with 4 key phases. Really recognizing that a recovery from COVID isn't just the one recovery, but it looks in a variety of different ways. Again, maybe I won't read all of this. We'll share this around, but we're in the decision point now. What we do really has an impact for a long time down the road. But I think what's the most interesting to me is this short-term recovery. And I think there was some great overlaps with some of the green infrastructure solutions that Adil was talking about. In the short term, we really need to look at, who's out of work now and how do we get them working? And also think about, how do we make sure that that's done in a just way as well. Yeah, again, lots of actions here that we can discuss, and maybe we can go to them in the question period. But maybe I'll highlight the fact that, we imagine something like an adaptation green infrastructure workforce where a bunch of young folks who are out of work, maybe they're in the accommodation or service industry, are trained up and they're deployed across BC in partnership with municipalities and Indigenous communities to do things like what Adil was talking about, and build rain gardens and do some fire smarting treatments and get ready for the fire season and things like that. Like that is something that we could do in the short term with all hands on deck to do that. So yeah, I had a few different categories of the short-term actions that we could do. And again, happy to discuss these down the line. Also some overlap with local food production and resource recovery. Especially, I think the pandemic has really made people understand the vulnerability of supply chains and wanting things to be more localized, especially things like our food, which is so essential. And there's clearly some climate action benefits to supporting local food production as well. And one of the kind of exciting pieces here that a lot of us are talking about are like a mass scale building retrofit program. That could also there could be an equity justice lens applied to that, prioritizing low income or social housing first, make those homes more comfortable, resilient to future climate impacts and cheaper to operate. And then in the longer term, move towards more of deep energy retrofits across our entire building stock. One thing I will mention is kind of that downer thing of like, we'll get all excited in the short term, let's create all these great jobs, but then we do need to make sure that we're prepared for a potential second wave, and that the types of solutions implemented now will withstand that potentially, or at least have that planned into it. And then in the long term, that's where we get into some of those more traditional like infrastructure projects, construction, an expanded retrofit program, and looking at potentially constructing a bunch of new affordable housing units across the province to get people working in that industry and also to solve our housing crisis. And then in the long term, we need to maintain that climate action. And CEA, we have this resource called the Climate Leaders Playbook that kind of highlights the big moves for high impact climate action. And it's great to see how a lot of what Taco and Adil addressed sort of fits into that. So I'm definitely feeling inspired to contact both of them and see how we can maybe apply some of that research into our work and outreach with local governments. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.